The average age of a constitution in other countries around the world is 17 years, but the United States Constitution has lasted almost 240 years. This presidential library is 35 years of visiting antique stores, going to estate sales, visiting bookstores, and putting each treasure that I find together. It's been an enormous experience. The one object in this room that gets my attention every time I walk in is the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington, 1795. It's the most famous portrait of George Washington, and of course it's in the center of the wall, and all other presidents are built around George Washington because he set the example of the American presidency. When you sit in this room and look at this portrait of presidents, it literally can transform you into another time. You look at these 45 luminaries. They were men of great talent, many of them. Men that failed in leadership, that succeeded in leadership. They're duplicitous at times. They show their hypocrisy at times, but they all have a story to tell. It's the American story, which is sometimes the good and the bad and the ugly. It's a way to take you into another world, and I've always believed that the best way to teach American history is to tell the story. America is an idea. It's an experiment. It's a story of contradictions. You know, all men are created equal. Jefferson, when he wrote those words in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, had 2 slaves with him. All men are created equal. So it's a story of contradictions. 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 73% were slave owners. But it's a story that keeps improving and getting better. It's also a story of compromise. The Declaration of Independence, in order to get unanimous support among the delegates of the 13 colonies, they had to strike out Jefferson's clause condemning King George for bringing slavery to the American colonies. That was a compromise. Jefferson eroded in the original draft. Jefferson was so horrified that the Continental Congress struck out and changed much of the Declaration that he would not admit that he was the author for about 10 years. America is often described as a democracy. America is not a pure democracy. It's a constitutional republic. As we know, pure democracies are subject to the tyranny of the majority. And that's not how America rolls. So the founders put into place a constitution that separates powers. It has an elaborate system of checks and balances, and it's a document that has survived now for nearly 240 years. The average age of a constitution in other countries around the world is 17 years. But the United States Constitution has lasted almost 240 years, and that is the reason. It's a document of longevity. I think there's a story about the American library system that's very important that we don't hear about. Benjamin Franklin was one of the first that actually founded a library in Philadelphia, and libraries brought books to the common person. John Adams said this: "As one looks down on the general reading room, which alone contains tens of thousands of volumes, which may be read without even the asking, one sees the seats filled with silent readers, old and young, rich and poor, black and white, the executive and the laborer, the general and the private, the noted scholar and the schoolboy, all reading at their own library provided by their own democracy. It always has seemed to me," Adams said, "to be the perfect concrete example of the American dream." I think it was the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia that articulated it best when he said the defining feature that has kept Americans free is the separation of powers. This was something that was unheard of in governments around the world when the Constitutional Convention took place in 1787. But it was an idea that was propagated by the philosopher Montesquieu, that all power should not be concentrated into one entity in government. So we have our 3 branches of government with checks and balances. In fact, Scalia said that's even more powerful than the Bill of Rights, is the separation of power, which has kept Americans free. William Shakespeare said, "Some men are born great, some attain greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon them." I think very little is circumstance. The majority of this would be leadership in America. Presidents step into the role, and the question is, how do they respond to the situations that are before them? FDR, Lincoln, Reagan, those are good examples. Washington rode his horse on December 23rd, 1783 to Annapolis, Maryland, to the temporary capital, and he voluntarily resigned his commission as Supreme Commander of the Continental Army. Other than Cincinnatus in Roman, 5th century Roman, no one had ever done that. Cincinnatus was a military dictator, and when they won the war over what is now Italy, he resigned his commission and went back home to be a farmer. Washington did the same thing. When King George III heard rumors that Washington was going to do that, he says, if it's true, Washington will be a great man. So it basically set the precedent of limited government, and when he resigned his commission, he could have been king. He was basically turning not only the government but the military over to civilian control, and that helped shape America. Critical decision, the most important decision that Washington ever made. And when I teach kids, I always say the most important decision was that he resigned twice. He did it in 1783, and then after 2 terms in the presidency, there was no 22nd Amendment at that time, but Washington, after 2 terms, voluntarily stepped aside and went back and retired at his farm in Mount Vernon and gave someone else the opportunity to step into the executive chair, and that was remarkable. Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase demonstrates the hypocrisy of politics. In American history, we see that presidents, what they preach, they don't necessarily practice. The Louisiana Purchase was a good bargain. It was $15 million. Napoleon needed money to fund his wars, so Jefferson sent over his Secretary of State Monroe to make the deal. It was totally unconstitutional because the president can't spend a dime without congressional authority. Jefferson did it, and he was backed by Hamilton. Now, Hamilton was a Federalist. They hated each other. Jefferson was an anti-Federalist, but Hamilton gave the thumbs up to the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase is probably the greatest example of a president making the right decision for the wrong reasons and reasons that were unconstitutional, but it did establish the doctrine of implied powers, which means a president can do something that's not explicitly stated in the Constitution. That started with the Louisiana Purchase, but it really went into warp speed with Teddy Roosevelt. Historians rate Lincoln as one of the top 2 presidents. It's either Lincoln or George Washington. What we forget about Lincoln is he didn't really have a good resume to be president. First of all, he didn't look presidential. He was a skinny country lawyer from Illinois. He had exactly 1 year of formal education. He got depressed, he struggled with insecurities, and he was just not typically what we would think of today as presidential material. But he was the right person for the right time. Prior presidents to him simply kicked the can down the road on the question of slavery. Lincoln confronted it head on. And he had said previously in Congress in his 1 term and in the state legislature in Illinois that the nation cannot exist half slave and half free. And he brought that mantra to Washington, D.C. Even before Lincoln was inaugurated, he had a lot of assassination attempts. He had a target on his head. There were people wanting to assassinate Lincoln on the train ride on the way down to Washington, D.C. He was a wanted man. No Secret Service at that time, only 1 security person. It's lucky he wasn't killed before he was even inaugurated. Just the election, not even the action, it was before any executive order, just the election. I don't think we've ever seen in history where an election would create that much controversy and cause states to start seceding. And that was the power of this old country lawyer from Illinois known as Abraham Lincoln. He was very underestimated. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts a president can have, to be underestimated. Ronald Reagan was underestimated. Harry Truman was underestimated. And so was Abraham Lincoln. If you want to find the reason for the Civil War or why the Civil War was fought, all you have to do is go to the writings of Jefferson Davis. And it's abundantly clear by his writings that it was to protect this institution of slavery. The Southern economy at the time of the Civil War in 1860 was the 13th largest economy in the world. Was it about racism? Yes, in part, but more importantly, it was about economics. The South wasn't going to give up the economy that they had. In the North, you got manufacturing and maritime. In the South, you got the agricultural economy. And slave labor built that. Historian Jeremy Black, who wrote the book on the Atlantic slave trade, says, if racism didn't create slavery, then surely slavery created racism. The Emancipation Proclamation was the introduction of federalism into the national government. Prior to that, the federal government basically ran the military, foreign policy, signed treaties, and printed money. But Lincoln said the federal government now is going to state that human bondage is evil, that slavery is wrong, and it's not a state issue anymore, it's now a federal issue. And that's what the Emancipation Proclamation did. It was a bold move by Lincoln and unprecedented. The decision from the Truman years that doesn't get enough attention is Executive Order 9981, where Truman says we are going to desegregate the military. Time and time again in American history, Black Americans, despite slavery, Jim Crow, the lack of equality, have yet volunteered to serve in the military, put on the uniform, and have gone and died for this country. After World War II, Harry Truman says, enough. No more segregation of the military. These men have fought valiantly. Many of them have died, and we're going to now desegregate the military. That was against the advice of his Joint Chiefs of Staff. They did not like that decision, but he signed that executive order because he knew it was an important step in civil rights. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was willing to be patient and resolute and weigh all the decisions before him. Of course, the military wanted to go in and bomb and take over Cuba. Kennedy was more hesitant. Kennedy had really good instincts. Not only that, he had served in the war and he had saw combat and he was injured in World War II. So Kennedy had good instincts. And during one of the meetings of the Cuban Missile Crisis, General Curtis LeMay, the commander of the Air Force, was actually disrespectful to the president. He sarcastically remarked that, well, you're in a hell of a spot there, Mr. President. And Kennedy, could have fired him on the spot. But he said, well, we're all in this together. And it was a very good response by Kennedy.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Nuclear weapons are so destructive and ballistic missiles are so swift that any substantially increased possibility of their use or any sudden change in their deployment may well be regarded as a definite threat to peace.
Kennedy had almost the perfect temperament to be president. And he was the right commander-in-chief to be there during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was resolute, he was patient, he was calm, and of course he had the attention of his brother. It is a good textbook example of weigh your options and don't shoot first and ask questions later. The Cold War is a war that takes place without a shot being fired. There were a lot of tensions between the West and the East, between the United States of America, Great Britain, and France, and of the Soviet Union, of course, the Berlin Wall. Reagan often said that Soviet communism will collapse under its own weight. He was a believer that it would eventually collapse. He just thought it needed a little push. And one of the keys to defeating the Soviet Union was the Reagan administration's military buildup, which was not necessarily for military superiority or to strike Russia, but it was to cause the Russians to have to spend money to build up their military and desolate their economy. And so Ronald Reagan basically broke the Soviet economy, and they had to eventually come to the bargaining table. Now, when Ronald Reagan was president, he went through 4 Soviet dictators: Leonid Brezhnev, Konstantin Chernenko, Yuri Andropov. And then Reagan got sort of lucky. He got Mikhail Gorbachev. He was a communist, but he was a little bit more moderate, and he was willing to sit down with Reagan and negotiate.
If you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And as hardline as Reagan was at times, he was always willing to talk. And if you look back at the Reagan record, he was willing to compromise. And compromise is one of, I think, the great successes of America. We have to be able to compromise.
This ceremony and the treaty we're signing today are both excellent examples of the rewards of patience. For the first time in history, the language of arms control was replaced by arms reduction. In this case, the complete elimination of an entire class of U.S. and Soviet nuclear missiles. With patience, determination, and commitment, we've made this impossible vision a reality. The importance of this treaty transcends numbers. We have listened to the wisdom in an old Russian maxim, Doveryae no proveryae, trust but verify.
Reagan is often called the great communicator. I would call him the believer. He actually believed in the American way. He believed in American democracy, and he believed that communism was wrong and it would eventually collapse. He truly believed what he preached. And that's the legacy of Ronald Reagan. I think the United States has faced becoming structurally in danger on 7 occasions. The first one was during the Articles of Confederation. The Americans win the war against Great Britain, and they start the United States of America, but they're being governed by an inadequate document known as the Articles of Confederation. James Madison was brilliant. He got delegates from most of the 13 states to come to Philadelphia to supposedly amend the Articles of Confederation. What he really had in mind is an entirely new governing document, and he succeeded. Had he not succeeded, I don't think the United States would be here today. So that was one of the points. The second one would be the War of 1812, of course, when Great Britain was coming back to say, hey, we're taking back the 13 colonies. The next was the nullification crisis in South Carolina of the 1830s during the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Congress passed a tariff act that South Carolina didn't like, and so South Carolina says, we're not going to obey that law. And Jackson says, yes, you will, because of federal supremacy. And he says, if you don't, I'm going to send troops. In fact, Jackson sent troops down, but eventually there was a compromise reached. And of course, the biggest two, I think, were the Civil War and then the Great Depression. Reconstruction was another time that the American democracy was facing extinction. It was a turbulent time, but we got through it. What previous presidents had done, Richard Nixon, for instance, Nixon knew that in the 1960 election that the Democrats stole votes in Chicago. Dead people were voting in Chicago, and all dead people, they all voted Democrat, thanks to Mayor Richard Daley. And also in Texas, there were stolen votes, and it wasn't a clean election in Texas. Nixon knew that, and for a moment, this is Vice President Nixon in 1960. He thought about contesting that election and contesting the electoral votes. Dwight Eisenhower called him on the phone and said, hey boy, he said, stand down, you're not going to do that. Concede the election, you can come back another day. The first president to die in office was William Henry Harrison. He gives this long inaugural address, which is about an hour and 40 minutes. And the rumor was he caught pneumonia and died 31 days later. He probably actually died from the water in the White House and caught a gastrointestinal disease. But this was the first time that a president had died in office. Now, the Constitution says when the president dies, the vice president shall assume the duties of the president. So the vice president is John Tyler, and he is in Virginia at the time. And he gets a knock on the door from Daniel Webster's son, and they say, William Henry Harrison, the president is dead. You need to get back to Washington, D.C. He comes back to D.C. on train and on horseback, but he doesn't go to the White House. He goes to a hotel. He takes the oath of office, and everybody in Washington, D.C., including William Henry Harrison's cabinet, basically made it clear, you're not the president. You're still the vice president. You're only taking over the duties of the president. You're sort of acting president. And Tyler says, no, I'm the president. He said, and I'm going to move into the White House and I'm going to have an inauguration. In fact, I'm going to give an inauguration speech. And he does. He moves in the White House. He gives an inauguration speech, and he exerted his leadership. The Constitution was vague about whether you're just assuming the duties of the president or are you actually president. Tyler made it clear, and he set what historians call the Tyler Precedent, because the Whig Party at the time were trying to diminish the power of the executive. They believed Congress, Article 1, should be the primary rudder for the country, not the presidency. And John Tyler pushed back that one decision when he became president to insist that I'm president, I'm not just acting president, was paramount to history. he would get mail that would be addressed to Vice President John Tyler. He would send it back to the post office. They called him His Excellency instead of His Excellency. And he was firm, though, in saying, no, I'm the President of the United States, and that's the way it's going to be. 7 other times, presidents died in office where the vice president was elevated, and they simply followed the example of John Tyler. So we call it in the book the Tyler Precedent. That wasn't fixed in the Constitution until the 25th Amendment in 1967, where they specifically stated or expressly stated that when the president dies, the vice president becomes president, not just to assume the duties. He or she becomes president. It has happened now 8 times in American history where a president has died in office, 4 assassinations, 4 dying for health reasons. And those vice presidents, some were prepared to assume the presidency, like Teddy Roosevelt, and others were not, like Chester Arthur and Millard Fillmore and Andrew Johnson. Teddy Roosevelt couldn't wait to get back to Washington, D.C. When he was sworn in New York, he got on a train and he couldn't wait to be president. He was born for that duty. Chester Arthur, on the other hand, when he was at his brownstone up in New York City, when the telegram came in around midnight informing him of Garfield's death, according to Chester Arthur's butler, the vice president put his head down on the desk and started sobbing like a child. He was crying like a baby. He was not prepared to be president. He didn't want to be president. Was he crying because Garfield died? I don't think so, because they weren't friends and they were not close. He was crying because he felt the weight of the presidency. You see, vice presidents don't feel the weight of the presidency until they get that call that says the president's dead. Lyndon Johnson, when he got the word in that hospital room in Dallas, Texas, Kenny O'Donnell, Kennedy's chief of staff, came in and he said, the president's dead. Johnson immediately took firm control. The peaceful transfer of power in American democracy, I don't think is a matter of luck. I think it's based on the institutions that were put in place with the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the separation of powers, but it also, credit must go to the individual, the president, like Nixon conceding the election, stepping down gracefully to keep the country together and coming back to fight another day. So it's really a combination of all those things. We've got a really durable document in the Constitution, which is almost 240 years old, and the average age of the Constitution is only 17 years. So it's several factors together. The single most important decision in the American presidency would probably be George Washington resigning after 2 terms. If you could ask for a close second, it would be Lincoln choosing to change as vice president when he went to Andrew Johnson. And of course, Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater. If Lincoln had not gone to Ford's Theater, that would have changed the trajectory of history. Lincoln would have presided over Reconstruction most likely in a better way than his vice president, Andrew Johnson, did. If Kennedy had taken the advice of a Secret Service agent and put a cover over the presidential motorcade, he most likely would not have been assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Kennedy would have lived on to serve the remainder of his term. When FDR was elected in 1932, he went down to Miami. He was the president-elect. An assassin was trying to kill Roosevelt, and he ended up shooting the mayor and killing the mayor of Miami. If that assassin's gun had been aimed just a few inches more to the left, he would have probably killed Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt never would have been president. In every decade, you have both politicians and citizens claiming that they're living through the most turbulent times in history. It's usually not true. You can't beat the Civil War. That was a very difficult time, and we survived it. We got through it. Some will say, America is the only country that fought a civil war to end slavery. True, but we're the only country that had to fight a civil war to end slavery. Other nations, such as Great Britain, ended slavery just by decree without having to go through civil war because there was a consensus. I'm not sure that the younger generation fully appreciates the paramount importance of free speech, the freedom to worship, the right to keep and bear arms, and the separation of powers. I wish that was taught more, starting in elementary, middle school, high school, and the universities. It's the separation of powers propagated by Montesquieu that helps keep us free and helps government from becoming tyrannical. We're not a pure democracy. We're a constitutional republic. The tyranny of the majority is not possible. It's not possible to have a dictator in America because we have 3 branches of government and the presidency is limited. The presidential powers are limited. But I think that's lost on the younger generation. Free speech is not free unless what I'm saying makes you uncomfortable. I can say something that is offensive. It needs to be free speech. I can say something that's not true. It still needs to be protected as free speech. The best counter to my speech is your speech. You should be able to debate me. Let's have a rebuttal. Let's have a debate. Tell me why I'm wrong. Don't try to censor me. Don't try to cancel me. Don't try to shut me up. We've had 2 periods in American history under 2 presidencies, John Adams and the Alien Sedition Acts and Woodrow Wilson, where they put people in jail for free speech. Those were 2 unfortunate times in our history. Free speech has to be free. And I think that young people need to take that with them for the next generation. I tell my daughter often, and a lot of young people, that to be an American, you're lucky. If you're born in America and you have good health, you're incredibly lucky. I want them to realize what an opportunity they have here. What I want future generations to understand about America is that this great constitutional republic is here not because of luck. It's because we have a written document, a constitution, that has a Bill of Rights and has a separation of powers, and it also is a country that has seen some really good leaders come through that have stood up to the test of time and have had the courage and the temerity to do the right thing, whether it's on civil rights or fighting the Great War or fighting World War II and fascism, Nazi Germany. We've been so blessed to have the right leaders in office at the right time. If Washington, Lincoln, Benjamin Franklin came into this library today in 2026, they would look at the copy of the Constitution and they would say, wow, you're still using that document to govern the nation? I think they would be surprised. I think they would be delighted. What I think about the most when I sit here in this room and I think about America's history is that we're very fortunate to have founding fathers who were flawed individuals, but they gave us a governing document that has lasted nearly 240 years. And with that, we've resisted tyranny. We've weathered a lot of storms, but America has demonstrated that it's a country of resilience and of sustainability and survivability. And I think if we keep the Constitution and keep electing wise leaders, Republican or Democrat, that we will possibly survive another 250 years. When I think about the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I hearken back to Constitution Hall in Philadelphia. But not in 1776, I think of 1788, when the delegates passed the Constitution and Dr. Franklin was leaving the building. And when he walked out, Franklin was 81. He's got long gray hair and he's walking with a cane. And as he walks out to the street, a lady yells, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government did we get? And he turned around and he looked at her and he said, a republic, if you can keep it. The thing I think about most as we hit 250 is, can we keep this republic? It is the greatest governing document ever devised by humankind, the Constitution. Immigrants from all over the world want to come here to this country because it's a land of opportunity. It's a land where they can decide who they want to be, where they want to live, to go to college or not go to college, to build wealth, to give to charity. It's the American dream, and I hope that for my daughter and for my granddaughter that we can keep this republic. The Constitution can be amended, and that's fine, but I hope that we can keep the republic because this is the greatest experiment that I think has ever occurred on planet Earth.
America's best days are yet to come.